Welcome to this session, last day of DevDays. We have Linda here for you. I'm your moderator. It will be a short session, 20 minutes. Linda's gonna, of course, take over. And at the end, we will have room for discussion and questions. And I'll be with you with the mic.
That's funny. I thought you said I'll be over. That's quite possible for me to be over.
Let me get back to you about that later, okay?
So I want to talk to you a little bit about provider appeals and some of the work we've done already at Optum and UHC around this. I'm really presenting on behalf of Chetan Jain, who is the true creator and works in this space every day. My name is, but my keyboard won't move. My name is Linda Michaelsen. I'm Director of Healthcare Interoperability Standards for Optum, and I serve a lot of roles in the industry around HL7 and Da Vinci, and I like to help make all this stuff work as best I can. I'm fortunate to be in a large organization, and we do an internal interoperability community of practice. And so we're able to run education sessions and try to influence the standard being used throughout the organization. The really interesting thing to me is we have a provider system that we use for UHC, and it's completely fed and completely sending out FHIR resources. In the past, we've talked to you a little bit about how we use measure reports for reporting things like the number of claims to the provider that they've submitted, how many were denied, reporting the measure in the measure report, how many for certain reasons, et cetera, using the different groupings. And we worked with Bryn Rhodes a lot on that, probably, I think this was started in 2018. Then we also had a challenge with appeals. So for those of you, it's a building slide. That's me. For those of you who don't know the appeals process, it's used both for claims and for prior authorizations. And what it is a claim will go in or a prior auth will go in. It'll hit the adjudication system or the prior auth system. And then for some reason, it's denied. So they get back in the claims process, a reviewed EOB on the prior authorizations. They are just entered into a prior authorization system, and they get the normal, denials by mail or by looking it up in that system. Then if it's denied or in some cases incorrectly paid, they can appeal that claim or that prior authorization. And so we wanted or needed to be able to represent that appeal in our provider system. So we reached out. We knew the provider system is all FHIR-based, and Sonia, who's in the back of the room, can tell you more about how to represent organizations, practitioner role, and the process we went through to get there. But our problem statement for this was we needed to get to those providers the data from our appeal system into our provider system so that it could tell the provider how many appeals they still had or the status of an appeal, that they could find it. Our provider system, we want them to think of as a one-stop shop. We didn't know what to use because, as you probably can guess, there isn't an appeals resource in FHIR. There isn't a claim, doesn't have a variant of it or prior authorization. So we reached out to another FHIR friend, Lloyd McKinsey, and he worked with us on using Task. So we looked at Task, and I'm going to show you on the next couple of slides how we configured Task to come from the appeals system. That same workflow is used in other payer systems that might need to know about appeals, and then also to our provider portal system. And I apologize, my slides do not want to move well for me today. So in Task, we put the you can see that we showed the appeal identifier, which is important, just like a claim identifier, and that's in task.identifier. And then we have our claim number. So which claim, or in, as you know, in FHIR, a prior authorization is a claim as well. So which prior authorization number, and we put that in the based on. And then our appeal status we used for the appeal status was the appeal accepted, denied, or is it just in a request status, etc. And then what is the appeal priority? You can imagine that being important for use, especially for prior authorizations. And we use the priority field for that. Our appeal type we put under the code, and I think on the next slide we have some examples of that. And then 4 was, on behalf of who's the beneficiary of the claim, or the, and that could also be obviously the patient, or it could be a provider. And then the appeal due date and the appeal submit date are in the requested period and the execution period of task. So it actually lined up fairly nice for the fields we needed. And then here we have on the requester who filed it, so that could be the patient again, or whoever's appropriate to a file. It could be a related person in the case of a child, etc. And then finally, for our output is our appeal decision, and that's usually some text, whether it's written or generated, that goes in there. And so all these fields now are coming from our prior authorization system into our provider portal, so they can read that more simplistically. They don't have to log into yet another system to get that information. So now what we really want to talk to you about today, and hoping that you'll have some thoughts for us on, is we'd actually like to start our process from the provider. We want the provider to actually file an appeal in a FHIR-like way. And we're talking yesterday and starting to think about this. And my friends who know DTR and CQL, and the plan definition, if any of you saw that presentation yesterday, the plan definition can actually show you what questions need to be asked. Because when an appeal is filed, they ask some additional clinical information. There's a whole series of questions that get asked and are filled out in the portal. What if you could get a questionnaire back like you do with the prior authorization in the first place, that asks the additional questions that you need to file an appeal? Same thing with a claim. When a claim is appealed, and it's also called grievance system, in the appeals and grievance system, they ask a whole bunch of questions of the provider, and some of those the system already knows about and has data on, right? So you don't have to you should not have to rekey that information in. So it could use the approach that DTR is doing with a plan definition, with a series of questionnaire that, based upon whether you say yes or no on a certain question, will go on and ask you additional questions to fill out the information. Can this be a smart app? Can it be the same smart app that is also doing the prior authorizations in the first place? Since everybody's in the process of building these right now, it's an additional consideration. It's really just another set of plan definitions with another set of questions that you can potentially populate as you go on. And then maybe we still share that task in that process to find out, the status of a claim back and forth between the app system and the other. Or maybe you don't need it. Maybe the DTR has it all solved with how they're going to finally represent it in that process. So as I mentioned to Martine, I'm curious about your opinions and questions around it. And of course, there's my buddy Jeff, who is the DTR author. And we've discussed this a little bit before, but I'll reiterate just briefly for him that we are talking about the possibility of using a plan definition and a questionnaire for the appeal of a prior auth, this very similar to the appeal of a prior auth first through. And we can also do that same process for a claim. So I'm curious because I'm hoping all of you are probably way more knowledgeable on appeals than I am. I'm a substitute presenter, and that appeals are not my area of expertise. So my first question for you would be, do you think prior authorization appeals or claim appeals could follow the route of a plan definition with the questionnaire and the questionnaire operation to answer those a lot of those questions and to facilitate it from the provider system and then be sent to the payer for determination? Thoughts? I shouldn't really ask for thoughts on a Thursday session, should I, Martine?
I think Bruno here was almost going to answer, right?
It's making sense to me. Perhaps that smart app could be subscribing to the prior auth, right? And then listening for updates, status update. And if it's denied, or I don't know if banded would also be a possibility here.
Is a possibility.
It could go back to the HR to get or execute those CQL rules and get more information and automatically send it back to the payer.
And I think the thing that I've been thinking about most is on the second round there, that might be a lot more notes or input from the provider as opposed to just data that's collected in the system and perhaps the back office could enter, because typically from my personal experience when I try to get something prior authorized or even a claim appealed, there's a lot of discussion that goes on and about it, and the provider oftentimes actually gets involved, and as my doctor would say, I have to get on the phone with them. And I think that's where a lot more of that detailed information is created and shared. That also means that maybe some of that information needs to be written back into the EMR at some point in time. And we really haven't talked a lot about that from the perspective of prior auth yet. So that's another area of curiosity for me. And I'm curious, Jeff, do you think it kind of follows along the same lines as DTR?
Okay, a couple of caveats. Number one, I came in late. Number two, I'm not as familiar with the appeal process, but what I do understand, it seems like a really good fit for DTR. So when you're saying Smart App /DTR, are you saying a distinct Smart App or the DTR Smart App that's included?
Did you see the question mark? It might be there for intention. I personally am a member of DaVinci, and I've already suggested this as a DaVinci project. I was thinking of it initially on its own as a project, but I can really see this being a next version of the prior auth IGs, because once you've sent a prior auth and it's been denied, your next step is to appeal it.
Right.
And it's going to probably gather some redundant information in the process of that appeal.
So I would say, just from what I do understand about the process, I would say that this is an ideal fit for DTR. That's the reason DTR was created as a modular component within the prior authorization suite. Is the functionality, just like the additional attachments piece. So I would say that I think that's the direction I would try to move forward with it.
And I most likely will. Well, I will. You know me. But the other point, I was wondering as I started thinking about this, Jeff, and especially in relationship to the DTR, are systems doing anything to write back more than like the prior auth number? Like the actual form submitted or the questionnaire or?
To this point, to this point, obviously the dominant space for which we're seeing examples of this are connectathons. And obviously DTR is not as heavily tested out as something like CRD is. So to this point, I would say, no, I'm not seeing much beyond that. Not to say that that's not going to be further down the road, but to this point, it's pretty well happy path.
Well, one of the reason I was asking is one of the things I saw on the portal, the UI currently for appeals, is they allow them to download a copy of, you know, what they submitted essentially for their appeal, because they're doing it via a portal, not a transaction where they theoretically have a copy of it. So I just wondered if that is going to start being a need potentially for prior auth too. Another thing to think about for, what is it, STU3 or whatever is next, I guess. And then I really appreciate the comment, and I apologize, I don't know your name, but with the about the way they could get updates on it would be a subscription potentially through the smart app. And I don't believe DTR talks about that quite yet either. So I've just defined Jeff's STU3 for him. I'm joking, of course. I have to go through, we have a formal process to go through to get things added to our to DaVinci implementation guides. But when Chetan and I were talking about this seemed a really natural fit for the work that had already been done and expands functionality in like the claims world where there really isn't, X12 is not mandated around any of this. And it's sort of greenfield that FHIR could come into play in this world. So that's, you know, what the only thing you may need to think about or providers may need to think about is converting their claims to an X12 claim potentially to a FHIR claim here, since it wants the attachment to be in FHIR. But there's potential that you could also attach a binary in some way of the actual 837. One of the things DaVinci does when it starts a project like this is we work with CMS and the NSG to make sure we're not stepping on any HIPAA problems that we should have, that might have. But mainly what is entered in the prior auth system is just the ID number for the claim. So they wouldn't have to should not have to include the claim in that process. Yeah.
Just one other small detail. This is very reminiscent of our attachments requirement through prior authorization for the additional documentation and the launch of CDEX and what CDEX's role is within this, since it's clinical data exchange. Obviously, at that point, we have to realize that the DTR component is focused on the questionnaire. So as long as it's a questionnaire, then DTR is launched. But if it's anything outside of the realm of a questionnaire, then it's not going to be the launch of DTR. Which is the same thing. That's why I bring up the corollary between that and the attachments, because CDEX gets launched. If it's additional documentation that's a PDF or something along those lines, it goes and does its thing, comes back and has fun. But after that, if it is questionnaire based, then it launches DTR.
Lots of questions to be answered, and that's what we hope this session would do, is to start people thinking about the overlap and possibilities. And until then, we'll just keep happily using our task between that current prior auth system and our provider system to at least make that task simpler.
Anyone else who'd like to share a thought or a final question? In that case, I want to thank Linda.
And I would like to thank Chethan for all the work he's done in making this possible in our provider portal.